stealth technology, the internet, GPS in the palm of your hand, autonomous operation.
Technology is a driver of our times. Since its founding in 1958 in the midst of the Cold War, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has been a driver of technology. Welcome to Voices from DARPA, a window onto DARPA's core of program managers. Their job, to redefine what is possible. My name is Ivan Amato, and I'm your DARPA host. And today I'm pleased to have with me in the studio Wade Shen, a program manager since 2014 in DARPA's Information Innovation Office. Wade earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and computer science from the University of California, Berkeley. He then attended the University of Maryland College Park, which is just about 20 miles from where we are sitting in DARPA headquarters, where he received his master's degree in computer science. And prior to coming to DARPA, Wade worked at the MIT Lincoln Laboratory in the Human Language Technology Group. You can tell from the portfolio of programs he runs at DARPA that he is fascinated by language, both of the human kind and of the computer kind. And you can tell also that he is driven by a very DARPA-esque vision of computers and human beings working together in ways that extend what either type of intelligence, computer intelligence or human intelligence, can do on its own. So thanks, Wade, for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks, Ivan.
So let's start out by talking about you, Wade, a little bit about your background and how you ended up at DARPA in 2014.
Sure. So, DARPA has this long string of research in communicating with computers in various forms, and I've been involved in a number of those programs over many years, from days of being a graduate student through my time at Lincoln. And it was sort of natural progression. I was working on a program as a PI, and then I knew the program manager really well, and he said, "Hey, you should think about coming to DARPA. This is an opportunity to do things that you can't possibly do in the job that you're currently at."
Before we dive into some of the DARPA programs you oversee, I'm hoping you can let us in on some of the overarching ideas you have about human minds and computer minds and language, perhaps in the context of these times, of our times, when so much of what we do involves people interacting with computers.
Sort of the history of this is that, computers were good at various kinds of things that humans weren't good at, like doing mathematical calculations without errors, repeatedly and very quickly. But the fact is that we didn't quite know how to harness that to solve problems that we really cared about. So any serious problem like decision-making of any kind, global scale policy, anything that you might think of, requiring human expertise to do, that wasn't something that we would engage computers in, right? It's just now that we're thinking about having computers drive cars, right? And that's a very basic function that, we trust large portions of our population to do, and comes naturally to human beings with some practice. But computers are just getting to the point where they can sense the world well enough that they can do that, and they can make decisions that are commensurate with what human beings can do on these very basic tasks. And a number of us want computers to be smarter because we want them to be companions that can help us do things, right? We want them to help us solve problems that are really, really hard for us, and to make decisions that are much more complicated than just driving a car, for instance.
Right. So let me just stop you on this idea of computers making decisions because, for the life of me, I cannot really always parse out how I make my own decisions. I presume that I'm bringing in different kinds of data, different elements, and then there's some kind of algorithm going on in my own head by which I make a decision about where I'm going to go today or if I'm going to buy this item versus that item. So can you talk to me a little bit about what does it take to put that mystery, into a working way into a computer, the mystery of decision making?
It isn't necessarily the case that we want to mimic human decision making anyway. Human beings aren't always great at making decisions. You know about the study of children and whether or not they'll take a Snickers bar now versus waiting for 30 minutes and then getting 5 Snickers bars, and they always choose the satisfaction now. And so we have all sorts of biases in our own decision making that makes us make decisions that are suboptimal for our own outcomes. Right? And this happens at huge scales. It happens when we make political decisions. It happens when we make economic decisions, and so on and so forth. And what you hope for is the ability to make better decisions given an outcome goal that you have, based on better data and better understanding of the processes under the hood. And that's where I think computers can help.
All right. Well, I for one, would personally like to be in a position where I can make better decisions in my own personal life. If we can do that also on national and geopolitical scales, all the better. So all the power to you, Wade. I hope that you succeed in that particular ambition. So what I'd like to do now is just talk to you a little bit about your portfolio of programs.
Sure.
Why don't we just start with the Memex program and tell us a little bit about what that is about and what its status is now and how it's been used a few times.
Yeah, so the premise behind the Memex program is really very simple. It's that there's data out there on the internet that we can't quite get a hold of or make sense of for investigative purposes. So our program concept was, how do we help people who are doing investigations online? And we started with human trafficking, because human trafficking is something where the point of sale is almost always online, at least for sex trafficking. We started with that particular domain because we noticed that the data is online. People buy and sell human beings online in ways that are grotesque and overt at the same time. And yet, because of the volume of the data that's out there, because it's hiding in a huge sea of even more data, it's actually really hard for investigators to explore effectively.
And it's not just the data that's in the kind of what most of us think of as the normal web, which is indexed by normal search engines, but in other places.
That's right. It's in places like the deep web and the dark web, places that commercial search indexes don't spend a lot of time dealing with. And, our only real view into that data is through commercial search engines, right? We rely on them to index and make available to search the content that's online. And if it's not indexed or available through Google, it's very likely you're never going to see it. And so portions of the dark web where a lot of crime happens, portions of the deep web where lots of ads for sex and for prostitution exist, a lot of that isn't fully indexed by our commercial search engines. And so the premise of the program was collect the right data and then automatically organize that data in such a way that we can explore that data and, most importantly, generate leads and detect instances of bad activity. And so we have been working for the last almost 3 years now to build a system that would help investigators, one, chase down leads that they have, but two, also identify leads automatically, potentially ads that are associated with trafficking so that they can prioritize their investigations. And so the concept here is, sort of back to this theme of human-machine interaction. The concept here is, how do you help the investigator get to the data that's salient for their particular investigation? And then how do you help them analyze data that they can't possibly analyze on their own? One of the key findings in that program was that the pricing behaviors of organizations that are involved in trafficking look different than the pricing behaviors of normal independent contractor prostitutes.
And you can detect those patterns.
But you can't see that by reading an individual ad online. You have to look collectively at a whole bunch of ads authored by the same person, sometimes tens of thousands of these ads, in order to understand the statistical pattern of how they price. Right? Do they price risky behaviors differently than the average in that marketplace? That's the kind of question that's very, very hard for an individual to answer without analytics that help them do that analysis over a large amount of data.
And Wade, has this tool, Memex, led to, I guess, the kind of deliverable that I imagine we all want, which is sort of taking down sex trafficking rings or other criminal activity?
Yeah. So, we since the beginning of this program, we have been engaged with law enforcement agencies across the country and really across the world. We have users in the UK and Canada and Australia and other places, not just the United States, who are every day working with these tools to arrest people. At this point, we have hundreds of arrests that have been credited to the use of the Memex tool and a number of different convictions that have happened out of that.
Well, great. That sounds like at least a slightly improved world via Memex, so that's great news. Let's segue to another one of your programs, the Data-Driven Discovery of Models program. So, Wade, what are you trying to do with this, and what's the status of this program?
Yeah, so the fundamental thought in this program is that when we want to construct an empirical model of how the world works, we use data to do that. Nowadays, there's data everywhere. And so the bottleneck for us to construct models of how the world works isn't any longer the collection of the data itself necessarily, but the actual process of constructing the model. That process is something that's relegated to people who are typically called data scientists or machine learning people or statisticians, right? People with that kind of title associated with them. And though the effort involved in constructing those models is huge, right? It's hundreds, if not thousands, of man-years of effort, largely because the data is messy, largely because how they model that data statistically requires lots of expertise in the areas of statistics and machine learning. And so what we've basically said is, hey, let's take that out of the hands of those kinds of experts and automate it. Let's automate the statisticians.
Before you go on, I want to hear about this, but also I want listeners to have a little bit more of a concrete sense. We've been talking in general terms about, models and systems. What might be some of the specific, say, phenomena that you're talking about for these kind of model development programs?
Just to give you a couple of problems that are concrete that people have been thinking about. One is, how would you, given different kinds of genotypes of various forms of wheat, how would you predict the yield of those varieties of wheat under different environmental conditions? That requires a model, and if you could do that, you could know what to plant any given year, depending on what you expect for the weather and the amount of rain and the particular soil location. You could make decisions that were much smarter than we make now. And so one of the problems that we're working on is this question of how do we predict crop yields based on data. And that data can come from genotype data, can come from environmental observations of sensors, i.e. like taking pictures of crop fields. It can come from, your farmer's almanac that tells you, 3 months from now what the weather is likely to be this season. So those kinds of data can build a predictive model of what kinds of crop yields you can generate. And if you can do that, you can, highly affect the outcomes of agriculture. So that's just one concrete example.
We probably can also link this to a big mission of DARPA, which is enhancing national security. Even when we're talking about food, that relates to things like food security. So if we can really keep our food supply constant and at the levels we need, that actually it does contribute to the cause of national security.
That's right. It helps us to predict political instability, for instance, in countries that we care about. So those kinds of models are always important. Socio-political models are important, right? Can you predict whether a riot is going to occur? Can you predict that political unrest of a certain type is going to result 10 days from now in some kind of bad event? Those are the kinds of things that you'd like to build models over.
What is the challenge then of getting a kind of computer with access to all kinds of data to generate those models? I don't know where the human mind comes into this, but to generate those models from the data and imperfect sort of amounts of information that are available.
So there's sort of two real problems that we have to contend with. So first of all, we have too much data of too many different kinds. And so the problem with that is that we don't know which combinations of the data are likely to explain a particular outcome that we care about. So if we care about crop yields, we need to know that temperatures of days prior to a particular event are associated with crop yield outcomes 10 days later. Right? That's the kind of thing that, requires some subject matter expertise in agriculture to be able to know. Computers don't know that.
So this is where symbiosis comes in.
That's right. So what computers can do is calculate statistics. They can estimate how well correlated a particular variable is or a particular kind of data is to a particular outcome we care about. And so computers can discover patterns that human beings have a hard time figuring out on their own. But human beings are also very good at figuring out that some of these patterns aren't real. Some of these patterns are what we call chance correlation. And so what we would like to do in order to build a really effective model is to find variables that matter, factors that affect the outcome of crop yields, for instance. We'd like to be able to do that automatically. But because some subject matter expertise is involved, we need the help of a human being to help curate this process. And so in the D3M program, the goal is to make...
And again, that's the Data-Driven Discovery of Models program, the D3M program. Go on.
Right. The goal of that program is to fundamentally change the category of labor from statistician and machine learning expert that constructs the model to machine plus subject matter expert that constructs the model. And so the idea is that we have a machine that automatically tests a whole bunch of models. And it does so in an efficient way. And, in general, for most of these problems, there are infinitely many models that could be used. And so the question is, how do you find the right one? And machines are very good at doing that testing in an automated fashion. And if they can work with human beings to constrain the kinds of models that they explore, they can potentially find models very, very quickly and very effectively without the need for expert machine learning personnel or data scientists.
It's fascinating. So let's move to the third program, the Quantitative Crisis Response program. So again, a little bit of a description of that program and what kind of progress you're making in it.
So the goal in the QCR, or Quantitative Crisis Response program, was to figure out how information affects people and to build a way to measure that. That's the fundamental goal in our program. So, with social media and fake news and propaganda being distributed by organizations like ISIS, right, our goal was to figure out how does that turn into a radicalization outcome? How is it that videos online convert people into fighters on the battlefield? So what we've been doing in that program is building models, again, of how human beings respond to propaganda and how effective those bits of propaganda are by looking at measurements of how people react in places like social media. And so the fundamental goal there is to build what we call a measure of effectiveness, which is really a way to measure concrete outcomes associated with various bits of information that are put out there, various bits of propaganda that are put out there. So, in the last couple of years, what we've seen is that organizations like ISIS can reach millions of people through social media. And they effectively recruit a small number of them, but still, when you can recruit millions, small percentages add up to a lot of fighters. And so the question is, how do they do that, on the one hand, and how effective are we at stopping them, or are they at actually achieving that outcome? And so what we've been building is essentially a gauge. It's essentially a meter that says, today that message that you put out has a higher degree of potential for radicalizing people than the one that you put out yesterday. And why that matters is that it allows us, people who are interested in countering radicalization, to estimate how well we are doing at preventing that radicalization from happening. We're essentially building a meter that allows us to know whether or not we're doing well or poorly.
So I think, one theme that seems to apply maybe to all of these programs is that idea of, how can human beings and their machines and their computers and all of their online resources, how can all of these things work together kind of in a symbiotic way so that we derive knowledge and wisdom from all of this interaction? It reminds me of really kind of the early days here of DARPA. In particular, I'm thinking of one of our more famous and early program managers, Joseph Carl Robnet Licklider. Most people know him as JCR Licklider, who was, even back in the 60s when he was a program manager here, was articulating this idea of a symbiosis between human beings and machines. I'm just wondering how does it feel to be a program manager, kind of working in this long tradition at DARPA? Well,
first of all, it's humbling. When you look at the history of program managers at DARPA and the various things that DARPA has produced over its lifespan, we are all humbled by the great outcomes that those folks had and the programs that were produced out of here. Most of us just try to do our job, but all of us are thinking bigger than the things that we could have done on our own. And that's the thing that DARPA engenders in all of us, right? It's the opportunity to explore an area of research that's much larger than anyone's research organization can do on its own.
Before we close out of our conversation, and I think this relates a little bit to what you just said, I'd like to kind of stand back from any particular program and maybe share with us some of what you've observed since 2014 as a program manager about DARPA's role in the overall innovation ecosystem. And that's an ecosystem that includes many players and stakeholders. scientists and engineers in academe, industry, and government labs. Those are some of the stakeholders, entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The science policy community. This ecosystem involves players in the commercial, environmental, national, defense, and other sectors. So where do you think DARPA fits into this overall sort of innovation dynamic?
Well, it's interesting, right? So there are a lot of, obviously, even within the U.S. government, there are a number of organizations that fund basic research, that fund applied research, that fund various projects along that continuum. And I think DARPA has a very unique role. It's a role that spans the gap between basic research and applied science. Oftentimes, we're looking for the applications that seem impossible, whether it's launching drones off of flying aircraft or detecting human trafficking online. All of these things are things that were emerging capabilities 3 or 4 years ago, but now have proven to be possible. And so DARPA is in a very unique place that allows us to push the technology beyond the theoretical stages to the point where we can actually see where the applications are going to be. So we're not builders of the ultimate technology, right? At the end of the day, we fund the research, and that research eventually becomes productized in other forms. But if you look at the progression of robotics and self-driving cars, all of those AI technologies were curated out of DARPA programs early on, and have subsequently, a 10-year horizon after that, become productizable. Industry has been able to take it up. So we serve a very crucial role. And the reason that we can serve that role is twofold. One, the program managers themselves. These folks come with the ideas and they can see the horizon. They've been working in the research. They understand the basic research that's happening in that field, and they can see the horizon
because all of
what's
you,
applicable.
this includes you. You've had boots on the ground
That's
in
right.
whatever particular technology category you're coming from.
That's right, and we don't stay long. And part of the reason we can't stay long is that we're going to lose view of the horizon if we do, right? We need to be back in the guts of that research. And so all of us are here for a temporary period of time, and I think that was a brilliant design decision in terms of how we structured DARPA. The other thing I would say is that the funding amounts and the catalyst that DARPA provides in terms of scope of programs is at the right levels to be able to do the kinds of projects that we can do as technology demonstrators and as early prototypes. Those are things that are really, really hard to do without a high level of investment. Because they often involve multiple disciplines from multiple fields who are at the edge of something, but that something requires them to all work together to build it. And to build the early stage prototypes of it and to fail multiple times potentially in the process of doing that.
Yeah, you bring up the failure and the tolerance for failure here. To me, that's one of the most interesting things about DARPA, because there are not all that many other stakeholders in the innovation ecosystem that can actually afford to do that. If you're a company, you might be able to fail a little bit, but you've got to be able to deliver a technology. You've got to be able to deliver to your stockholders eventually. Whereas here, I guess program managers like you can probe technology possibilities and determine, is this something that has a good likelihood of moving forward? In other words, you can take the risk down for others who then might take it to the finish line.
Exactly. So I worked in the startup world prior to going to Lincoln, and one of the things I can tell you there is that, there's actually relatively little tolerance for risk. The kinds of risks that you can tolerate are not the same as the kinds of risks that we can tolerate here at DARPA. The concrete idea that you have in a startup better be actionable as a product in 3 to 4 years. Otherwise, there's no sense in funding that. There's all sorts of business-related risk, execution-related risk, but technology risk can't be the biggest portion of that. At DARPA, we can take technology risks, science risks. And I think that's actually the fundamental thing that allows us to do what we do.
So Wade, like other program managers, you are a technology developer. You are exercising your science, engineering, and kind of technology imagination to imagine what might be possible and then really determining whether in fact it is or might not be. So I'm just wondering if there is a kind of fictional technology that you might have been thinking about, who knows, since you were a kid, that you wish were real but isn't yet real?
Well, so that's a fun one. Being a language person, the thing that and one that worked on translation for many years. For years we've been sort of striving towards this kind of Babel Fish kind of capability. Do you know what I mean by that?
No, I don't. I was going to ask you what does Babel Fish mean.
Yeah, if you never read the sci-fi books by Douglas Adams, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and so on. In the various interstellar spaces, right, everybody speaks a different language. So the solution to this is the Babel fish. It's the fish that you put in your ear, and then suddenly you can hear in your own language, the translation, the perfect translation of all of these alien species
universal
speaking. The universal translator, right? It's exactly from Star Trek, right? It's what's really fascinating is the last couple of years, because of the work that's going on in deep neural networks and the cool work that's been going on both in DARPA-funded research and in commercially funded work, we're really getting close to that. So there was this paper last year by Google that described the use of multiple languages to do translating from multiple languages into a language, and training those translators from various different forms. And what they discovered is that these neural networks learn kind of a universal semantic representation of language as part of the process of training that's emergent. It's an emergent property of how these neural networks were built. And so what it leads to in the long run is potentially actually having a universal translator. And that is going to be a really cool thing.
Right. And just give it a shot. So if we were to give listeners an idea of what you mean by neural network.
Yeah, so we use the term neural network. It actually has very little to do with neurons as in the cells in your brain. But these are models of how your neurons work, sort of very primitive models of how your neurons in your brain work, that are composed together to form little small brain-like units. And what the Google guys did was they figured out how to build a neural network that could take information from multiple languages and essentially regularize it into a form that would allow it to translate into English. And that intermediate form, which is just some layer in the middle of this rather large neural network, happens to have properties that look the same across multiple languages, meaning that it's effectively like the shared semantics of different languages.
Of all languages.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thanks for sharing that. It sounds like we might be going from the idea of a fictional universal translator to something that we might actually, all of us, be able to use.
Hopefully.
All 7.4 billion of us on the planet might be able to talk to one another.
That's right, in the thousands of languages that we speak.
So, Wade, we have covered a lot of fascinating ground here, and I just want to thank you for this engaging conversation.
Well, thank you, Ivan. It was great talking to you.
And thanks, listeners, for sharing this time with us. I hope you join us again for the next Voices from DARPA. For more information about Wade, his programs, and the other breakthrough technologies DARPA is working on, visit darpa.mil. And for links that enable you to download this podcast, go to the Voices from DARPA page on DARPA's website.